Can prophets prophesy over everyone? The answer is no, he cannot do that. And yet I'm sure many of you have been in services where a man or a woman prophesies nearly over everyone in the service, right? Or they gather a meeting and almost everyone gets a word from God. Well, friend, prophets do not have the ability to prophesy over everyone. Here's what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. He lists for us in verse 7 through 10, 9 gifts of the Spirit, and one of those gifts is the gift of prophecy. Then he says in verse 11, all these, all right, including prophecies, all these are the work of the one and same Spirit, and he distributes them to each one just as he determines. As who determines? The Holy Spirit determines, not as the prophet determines. The prophet can't prophesy simply because he wants to prophesy. He can only prophesy if God gives him a word to prophesy. So you might be saying to me, but what about these prophets who are prophesying over everyone? What's happening then? Well, they're not prophesying in most cases because the Holy Spirit's guiding them. They're prophesying out of their own spirit or their own imagination. This is what the prophet Ezekiel says in his day, and he says this in verse 3. This is what the sovereign Lord says: woe to the foolish prophets who follow their own spirit and have seen nothing. Then he says they prophesy over their imaginations. See, it's possible for a prophet to feel something in his spirit for someone. Well, that's fine. We all feel something in our spirit, but that doesn't mean it's the Holy Spirit. It's your spirit. And then he says they prophesy over their imagination. They imagine something, and then they create a prophecy to fit their carnal mind. See, this is when it gets really bad. It's when their carnal mind begins to create prophecies for people, and it becomes dangerous. And really what I've noticed is these prophets prophesying over everyone is turning into, like fortune telling. It's turning into psychic reading. You go to a psychic, man, they'll give you a prediction. They'll give you a word because they're getting paid to do this. But that word is not coming from the Holy Spirit. And in many cases, these words are not coming from the Holy Spirit. It's coming from the prophet's own spirit. They feel something in their spirit, or they have an imagination. They want something to happen. And this is why their predictions and their prophecies often are not guiding people the way it should be guided. I think about it. In the last U.S. presidential election, I heard so many prophets prophesy that Trump was going to win. I did not hear one prophet, not one, prophesy that Trump was going to lose. Not one. Everyone was saying he's going to win. But when he lost, what was the problem? The problem was the prophets were prophesying out of their own spirit. That is, their own desires. They have desires in their heart, and they wanted him to win. Therefore, they prophesied what they wanted. This is what Ezekiel is warning the false prophets. He's saying, you all want Israel and Judah to prosper and be rich, but because of their disobedience, judgment's coming, and you don't want to see this. See, I believe in personal prophecy. God uses me quite often in the area of prophecy. Just last Sunday, about 100 or so people came forward to receive wisdom and direction from God. And of the people I prayed for, 3 people I had a prophetic word. 3 out of about 100. Because I only give words that God gives me. Now, I have felt pressure at times by maybe pastors that are inviting me to preach. They want everyone to get a word from God, and I can't do this. I often go to South Korea, and I'll preach to maybe 400 pastors. And on Sundays and on their Bible studies, I'll preach to a lot more than just pastors. But in these meetings, I'll preach maybe 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And I'll preach maybe for 20 minutes, and then the 400 pastors will stand up. They will all get in a line, and I will go down the line and lay hands on each one. And what they're hoping for is a prophetic word, especially since I'm a best-selling author in South Korea. I wrote a book called You Can Prophesy Your Future. And so people are looking for that prophetic word from me. Well, I can't give a word unless God gives it to me. You understand? And I'm not going to feel pressure. I'll just pray for them, bless them the best that I know how, but I'm not going to prophesy unless God gives it to me. Now, one time when I was in South Korea, I went to go preach for this one particular pastor, because they usually give me a circuit of churches. I'll go preach at maybe a half dozen or so churches when I'm in South Korea. So I preached at this one particular church, and it was a small building, maybe 100 people, but it packed out. Then the next day I preached in that same city in another church, and it had about 100 people or so, and it was also packed out. But while I was preaching, I looked at these two pastors and I had a prophetic word. I said, God is calling you two to join forces together and build one church. And that church is going to be dynamite. I see so many people, hundreds, maybe thousands of people coming to your church. Well, you know what? God was already dealing with them about that. And they did that. Well, years later, I went back to South Korea, and the host pastor said, these pastors want to meet you. They want to show you how your prophecy came true. And when I came to that same town, there was one church this time, but it had hundreds. It had about 800, nearly 1,000 or so people, stadium seating. It was jam-packed, not an empty seat, and God worked great miracles. Man, wonderful miracles took place. But here's a good example. The pastor said to me, your prophecy came true. You gave us direction, something that God was dealing with us about, and look what God has done. Thank God for the gift of prophecy. It works. But a prophet cannot prophesy out of his own spirit or his own imagination. He has to give a word only if God gives him or her that word.